In this set of videos, we've been looking at the period of the war years from 1939 until 1945. And in these war years, we're going to look at two aspects. In this set of videos, we've been looking at Germany, but we also need to look at the occupied countries. These set of videos are focused really quite specifically on Germany itself. And we've been looking at the impact of the war in the early years from 1939 to 1942. We looked at the impact of the war on opposition, and finally we looked at the impact of the war in the later war years from 1942 to the end of the war in 1945. Throughout these videos there's been one big historical question really that sat underneath all three of those bullet points there. And that question is whether the German people supported the war or not. And that's the question that I'd like to look at in this video today. And that question is, did the German people support the war 1939 to 1945? And it's a really big historical question that historians are still looking at today, and there's not really a right or a wrong answer with it. It's also the sort of question that you might get asked in an exam, and this question here appeared in one of those OCR exams a few years ago. The German people did not support the war between 1939 and 1945. How far do you agree with this view? And as ever with these big essay questions, there are always two sides to the argument. The first argument here agrees with the question. The German people did not support the war. But there's also a counter-argument that actually the German people did support the war. And it's really important when we do an essay like this that we think about those two sides to the argument, and we make sure that we've got some evidence for both sides. The evidence doesn't have to be balanced, so you might have more points on one side than the other, but it's really important that you've got evidence for both sides of the argument. Now, if you wanted to, you could pause this video here and you could write your own essay plan based on what you've learned about in the last three videos. Or if you want, you could keep playing and I'll show you what I've come up with. So let's deal with the German people did not support the war first. To me, the biggest piece of evidence to show that the Germans didn't support the war is the fact that the army resisted Hitler and the war effort. And the army in particular, and when we look at one key case study here, is Colonel Stauffenberg and the July bomb plot. And the fact that Stauffenberg and his conspirators were planning on blowing up Hitler, to me shows that actually not all Germans did support the war effort. Another piece of evidence we could look at was the fact that there was public criticism of the war. And there's some really good examples of this public criticism. The White Rose Group in Germany, who are those students who passed leaflets around Munich University. They're a really good example. Cardinal Galen, who delivered sermons really complaining about the terror and the use of the Gestapo at the time, again shows that people didn't really support what the Nazis were doing. And then thirdly, there was also those examples of passive resistance from the public, and the fact that the public, arguably, not all of them supported the war. And the best example of that really is Otto and Elise Hampel, who wrote the postcards really bemoaning what was happening at the moment and criticising Hitler and the war effort throughout for 2 years in Berlin. Now, although those examples there are small examples and the number of people involved in each one of those examples is minimal, to me they show that the Germans didn't all support the war. So we've got one really good side to the argument. Let's look at the reverse though. Let's look at the counter-argument. And there is a counter-argument that the German people did support the war. And there's evidence to support this side of the argument too. For example, the fact that the German people fought to the bitter end of this war shows that arguably they were really behind it. And even in April of 1945 in Berlin, the German people were fighting hard against the Russians who were trying to break into the city. And the fact that they fought with such ferocity shows that arguably the German people did support the war effort. And they believed that they could have won the war, even right at that bitter end. Another piece of argument, another piece of evidence that really proves that I think that the German people did support the war is the fact that they went along with the total war movement. And there's lots of things we could choose to show this. For example, 1 million women joined the workforce after Goebbels delivers his speech in 1943. That to me shows that people did support the war. Or also, you could look at the fact that men join up in quite vast numbers to join in the Volksturm, or the People's Army. And that fact that men are joining up, to me, again shows that arguably the Germans did support the war. Now, there's counter-evidence we could use here as well, and if we really wanted to be clever, we could say that arguably 1 million women joining the workforce was a good thing. However, the Germans actually, the Nazis, wanted 3 million to join in, so maybe that wasn't huge evidence. To prove this, and maybe the fact that some men are joining the Volksturm, but not everybody did, maybe does dilute that a little bit, and you could include that in an essay. Now again, as ever with these OCR essays, you really only need 4 points, and we've got 5 on the screen here. So we have to think about which piece of evidence could we not talk about. You don't have to talk about all these, and for me, I probably, as sad as it does make me, I probably would ignore the passive resistance from the Hampels. I think those other 4 points are stronger, more significant pieces of evidence that to me prove my argument better. Now, as ever with the OCR paper, you could get 17 out of 18 marks just by explaining those 4 points really well, but to get that 18th mark you need your clinching argument. And I think there's lots of different clinching arguments here, because I think this is one of those really good essay questions where actually there is not a right or a wrong answer. One really easy clinching argument here would be the fact that I think that you could say that the numbers of people who were actively opposing or resisting the Nazis were so small, arguably it proves that the German people did support the war. Or you could argue that actually nobody really supported the war, the Germans actually just went along with it because they were living in such great fear. And that would also be another really good clinching argument. You've got an essay plan now in front of you. I think it's a really good opportunity now to write this essay and really try and consolidate everything you've learned about in the last 4 videos.